Hello class, Professor Barry Brennan here. I am back to do part 3 and hopefully our last lecture. We're discussing types of reasoning. We've just pretty much at length discussed deductive reasoning, and now we're going to get into inductive reasoning and the types. So let's go straight to that PowerPoint. This is for my argumentation class if you haven't figured that out already. Here we go. All right, so here we are. So 3 types of inductive arguments, or when we use inductive reasoning, we're talking about types of inductive arguments, how we make inductive arguments, right? You learned how we make deductive arguments. Now we're going to look at how we make inductive arguments. And remember, inductive reasoning is going from, I always forget this and I have to actually look at it because I want to make sure I'm right, is going from specific to general. And deductive is going from general to specific. So in inductive reasoning, we use like specific examples to make a generalization, basically. Okay, but specific examples, right? And we're going to talk about what kind of arguments are made that way. And deductive is we have something general and we draw specific things from that. See, you can be teaching this for a while and still have to like look at your notes for these things because I have to keep it. It's not in my mind. It's not always like concisely clear. So here we go. So types of arguments. We've got arguments by example, inductively arguing by example, inductively arguing with analogy, and using what we call causal correlation. So we're correlating means we're looking at the relationship and if there's a causal relationship between things. And oftentimes the correlation means relationship. So what's the causal relationship? Okay, argument by example. Argues one or more cases with a specific class of cases that share common features. I want you to think about this. Because I always think, for me, I think about this in terms of, I watch a lot of shows that deal with the law, whether it's police shows or shows with lawyers. And I think about this a lot. It's an easy way for me to understand it. So when you think of argues one or more cases with a specific class of cases that share common features. Okay, think about that, right? You know, like class action lawsuits, people have similar things going on and they focus on maybe one organization or one company that's doing something wrong. And they have a whole bunch of people with all of those things happening to them, like they're getting cancer or maybe they're working in a meat packing factory and people have lost their limbs because they have unsafe practices or, you know, appendages or something. So keep that in mind, okay? Arguments are based upon generalizations from known cases to unknown ones. So let's take that. Let's take the meatpacking industry. And different things have been talked about that in terms of who they hire, right? Unsafe practices and how they treat people who are undocumented, which are people who are undocumented are in a very scary position because they're, quote, undocumented. And then their rights, their ability to stand up for themselves is hindered by that because the U.S. government may not recognize them as having rights because they're undocumented citizens. So that's a whole thing that happens by being undocumented. And I'm not arguing that they should not have rights. That's not what I'm arguing at all. I'm just stating that this is part of what happens to someone who works in a country, whether it's this country or whatever country, and you're not documented and you're not even seen as a person, right? It's like you're invisible. So let's look at that meatpacking industry because a lot of information has come out of that of using undocumented workers. So right there, they don't have a voice. But when they look at like what's happening to people in that kind of industry and the rate, they have to look at how many cases are people getting hurt and what kind of, obviously they're getting hurt. It's not mentally, it's like physically hurt. And then the arguments are based upon, they make an argument if a lawyer is going to take a class action case like this, they're going to propose that something needs to change in the safety practices, like OSHA practices, in that industry, because based upon what's happened already, they make a projection, more cases are going to happen in the future if they don't make this change. Argument by example. You with me? Does it make sense? So what you want to, when I say be careful not to make hasty generalizations, means you don't want to jump the gun. You need to have the information. So let's again use it. It's a good example. It's a meatpacking industry. There's a whole bunch of people in there, and they're having a rate, this particular packing company is having a rate of 2 accidents. It ends up being, maybe there's 2 in a week, but it's 2 accidents per month. Now, I don't know if I was the lawyer, I would have to look at what's the common in a meatpacking company that has a good reputation, is following OSHA standards, what kind of accidents is happening to them that have high standards versus this one. How do you then determine, we'll look at correlation in a minute, but that's how you would determine, right? Is something in this industry, if they're having 2 accidents a month, but in this industry it's the same, then that would say, or not industry, in this company it's the same, and it's already been looked at by standards, U.S. government standards, and had people come and inspect, health inspectors, etc., and they're averaging 2 accidents a month, then you might think that that's a normal part of business in that industry. It might just be, because depending on what the kind of accidents they are. But if this is having like 8 accidents a month, and what you expect with your insurance and stuff that you might have 2, and this is having 8 or 10 or 12, then you know something's wrong with this company. Okay, am I kind of making sense of how you figure these things out? So these are the kinds of questions you want to ask yourself when someone is making an argument and when you're making an argument, right? When you get into a debate, you want to be able to say, okay, you're saying that this many things are happening and you're giving these examples, but what are you comparing it to? Because that's kind of how we know where a standard is. Where do we get the standards from? We decide what the standard is, and we have to have an example of someone that's meeting the standard in order to make a comparison. All right, moving on. So 1, a significant number of examples are needed to support a claim. So you have to have a lot. Arguments are challenged based on sufficiency. Do you have enough? If you're going to argue that the cows this week's, this particular discussion board, and we're talking about factory farming. If you're going to argue that agriculture or cows, the dairy industry, let's say example, the dairy industry has contributed to climate change, you're going to have to give enough examples of the amount of dairies it takes for that climate change to create that. You can't just say one dairy is doing it. You have to show that there's this consistent pattern of things, the way dairies are managed or the way dairy production happens with the cows and with the food that they eat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There has to be a number of examples to show that this is what you're arguing is actually a fact. Examples must be typical of a specific class of claims. So they have to be in the same class. You can't talk about cows, the dairy industry, and then talk about, I don't know, what other, maybe even goats. Okay, you can't. Goats and cows are not the same thing. You might drink goat milk and you might drink cow milk. But how goats are raised and how cows are raised are totally different. They're not the same. They're not the same animal. So they couldn't be in part of that class of claims. And claims must be relevant to the specific case. I think we've already established that. Let's go on to the next one. Argument by analogy. So analogy is where you make a statement drawing a comparison between 2 or more cases. So let's go back to that cows and goats thing. Let's say you want to use the dairy industry. You're making this argument, right? And you're looking at dairy industries or the dairy companies, dairy production facilities around the country. Maybe just limiting it to the state of California. And you're looking at the impact the dairies are having on the immediate environment and the cities, et cetera, the groundwater. And then you draw a comparison between, I don't know, let's say this, why people should drink almond milk. Maybe your argument is don't drink cow's milk. So you look at the comparison between what kind of pollution is being produced by almonds. By the way, almonds use a lot of water. And you would want to know how many almonds does it take to make almond milk? Like what's all in that? But you could draw a comparison to show like this, to show actually by contrast of why one is so bad than the other. So a figurative analogy is a statement of the comparison between cases that are material dissimilar but suggestive of each other. So the literal analogy was the one I gave you. Okay, either it be like almond milk or maybe even goat's milk, because they're different, they're dissimilar. But the figurative analogy means the comparison between the cases are materially dissimilar but suggestive of each other. So perhaps, here we go, you look at the dairy industry and then you look at the rate of cancer in the area between with the amount of dairy in the dairy production and the rate of cancer in the community. And they're not the same, but one is suggesting causing the other. There's analogy, or the rates are the same. I think I'm giving you the right example there. Okay, one method of testing the validity of an argument by analogy is to use Fisher's narrative fidelity and probability. What the heck do I mean by that? So Fisher, do I even talk about Fisher? I'm going to talk about Fisher in another lecture. So just let's bypass that. Let's look at analogies must have a meaningful connection. So in order to make an analogy, which you're drawing a comparison, they have to have some kind of connection to each other. They must have similar characteristics that are accurately compared. So the characteristics of the analogy, they must be comparable, right? Like goat milk and cow milk, and they're both agricultural animals. And you want to avoid, when they say false reasoning by analogy, it means trying to draw a comparison where there is no comparison. The example I always love to give is a student who gave the speech and tried to draw a comparison between Burning Man and Coachella. There is no comparison between those two other than their events. Beyond that, they're not the same. They're not comparable. Okay. I hate to do this to you folks, but I'm going to have to stop here and pick up a really short lecture. Otherwise, I'm going to go over time. So we've talked about analogy and we've talked about example. Example is probably the easiest way to understand. Analogy may be a little harder. And next, we're going to talk about causal correlation. Okay, looking at the relationship between things. And we'll be right back. Thanks for hanging in there.